So what's the next part of that story? What about the supply side, Bryce? Let's talk to that story here. And what we've got is, this is, to the point that Paul Keating made. In 1987, in August, he had to make a call. He had to basically look at the feedback that was coming in and the data, and what did they decide to do?
So in August 1987, Cabinet submission for the debate on restoring negative gearing, the then Treasurer Paul Keating did suggest that the abolition in 1985 had caused investors to leave the rental market, pushing up rents. Okay, so this was the Labor Treasurer at the time, said that it pushed up rents and caused investors to leave the market. The tax reform changes have now been in place for 2 years, which would appear to be a reasonable period for adjustment to have worked through so that the investors may again return to the rental markets, the submission said. Important.
And they weren't. So he obviously said, let's let it ride. And that's similar to what New Zealand did. They let it ride for a couple of years, and then actually this is having a negative impact. So what I did is I went and had a look at the dwelling unit completion. So I jumped into the ABS data last week to sort of see exactly what was happening. Now, when we're talking about units, don't mistake that in terms of apartments.
It's units
or
of stock, not
That's
a type.
Right. That is in completions of dwellings, which would normally be houses at that time. So what's important to note here is, let's sort of talk to the data. So through 84, 85, we had some pretty healthy number of dwelling completions, and again in 85 to 86. Now, these are completions, and now you remember it takes usually half a year to actually build houses. So you can see that we had obviously the lagging effect because it was July of 1985, so we didn't have much time. So all of those buildings that were half completed and so forth, they would have been added to those completion data stocks later on. So then 1986 and 87, when ultimately everyone would then learn that there's not the ability to negative gear anymore, effectively what happened? So in 1986 and 87 and 87 and 88, there was that lag effect, that slowdown. So when I get my completions, when I'm starting, I've then got to complete those. Now, at the back of 1987, when negative gearing was reintroduced, you saw a spike of new dwellings. In fact, of that 5-year period, you've got the biggest number of completions. So it definitely helped to incentivize some of those completions. Now, we can't just argue that it's all got to do with negative gearing, but if you think about that time, because obviously after 1989 into 1990, we had the recession that we had to have, and the marketplace generally was quite sluggish in terms of the economic activity during that time. So this was in that lead up of that period. We had obviously the 87 stock market crash, that we've also got to think about some of those other elements. But on the whole, it's very clear that we had a spike of dwellings after, and then we had a spike prior. But during that period, it's really clear that we didn't have that supply. We had a supply decrease.
I think the key takeaway here, Ben, is you're right. There's other factors, and it'd be ignorant for us to suggest it's directly proportionally related. But the point is that whilst there was a policy in place that changed for that 2 years, the goal of providing supply to the marketplace failed. If you look at that as a trend graph, 143, 141, so those 2 years, the trend would look quite flat.
Yep.
Then you'll see a clear dip and then a significant increase afterwards. So the point of that part of the story is, right now, the overwhelming opinion of any expert at the coalface in property in this country says that the solution to housing is supply. And if you have a look at history, you can see that there are definitely ramifications to supply.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about the supply dynamics and how challenged supply is in the second half of today's show. All right, so let's move on now. So we're back into the history story around negative gearing. Now, let's not just make this about the Labor Party, because obviously there are other parties who have also seriously considered negative gearing reform, and that includes the Liberal Party under the leadership of Malcolm Turnbull and then the Treasurer Scott Morrison at that particular time. So they looked at 5 options from Treasury, so similar to the way in which Albanese and Jim Chalmers are now looking at what options. Treasury options in terms of so they had a look at all of those different things, including things like reducing capital gains tax to 25% and limiting negative gearing as part of that story. And then they took finally to Cabinet, they decided on a proposal to cap negative gearing deductions to a $20,000 a year cap. Now, at that point in time, to obviously the benefit of supply and allowing for rental properties to continue to flourish in this country, it was clear that the Cabinet decided to not enforce that. So ultimately, we didn't have changes to negative gearing or capital gains tax back in that period.
All right, so both sides have had a swing at this, Ben?
They have. And then we get serious. So ultimately, then we see Bill Shorten and his treasurer looking at that particular option when it comes to negative gearing, and they took to the 2016 and also to the 2019 elections changes to both negative gearing, whereby they would grandfather existing arrangements, but only offer negative gearing on new property, and also look to adjust the capital gains tax concessions to 25% instead of 50%.
I'll tell you a story there, Ben. I went to the 2019 election. I was falling asleep because obviously the change to negative gearing would have an enormous impact on how we were able to serve our community. And I remember falling asleep that night. I was feeling a bit under the weather. I went to sleep early thinking it was a foregone conclusion. And then I remember waking up at 1 o'clock. My youngest son came in, and so my wife and I had to get up to him. And I remember turning my phone on and seeing text messages ping left and right. So it was going to bed thinking that, and one thing that we were going to have one government, and the next thing, the unlosable election had happened. But importantly, it has been tested at the electorate level with these policies that the electorate largely doesn't like the interference that comes.
Well, I think there's some logic to that, and we'll get through that and unpack that as part of this story today.